Welcome in. You didn't find this by accident. This is the Whisper Lounge, a soft space for the conversations we weren't supposed to have. While you're here, you can leave a tip using the captivate.fm link in the show bio. And if you're ready, your complimentary 7-day exploration journal is waiting. Just head to whisperlounge.club/join to claim it and be one of the first to step inside to explore. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of this currently untitled podcast. I'm really looking forward to creating these episodes, getting to know the people that are listening, and truly I'm using it more as a creative outlet for myself. I find myself doing a lot of math, organizational, strategic type things in my real everyday life, and I want an outlet where I can be creative and talk about things that are important to me and not necessarily things that would come up in everyday life. So one of those things that I want to talk about is, and I'm going to say this word and it's going to mean something to each of you, but I mean it in the broadest sense possible. And so as we talk more, maybe they'll give more understanding as to the different facets. The word is sex and sexuality. So that's something that I am fascinated by. It's important to me. It's a lot of fun for me to explore and talk about. But it's also something that I find so deeply impactful for human beings. And it's just fascinating to me that we don't talk about it more. As I've gotten older, I don't know how you feel, but I've realized that, wow, sexuality is so integral to who I am, and it impacts so many things. And we'll just TMI and get into it. First of all, there won't be any TMI on this podcast, so we're just going to get right into it. Anything associated with my genitalia impacts me so deeply. Potty training is such a psychologically important phase for a child. And why? It's dealing with your genitalia. I don't know. It's just, I've had 2 children, so I've gone through childbirth. That involved some genitalia, and then on top of that, it's like this physical expression of a very deep rooted part of our humanity. So for me, I feel like it should get talked about more, and I want to create a safe space to do that. So for the last 5 or 6 years, I've had, and I have to say that in the last year, I have not been as faithful, but I've had a weekly dinner with my girlfriends. Just happens to be girlfriends. I don't know why. Men were never a part of it, but and we have begun talking about these topics. And I've been on my own journey of exploring and that sort of thing. And what I hear from my friends is that that's the only place they get to talk about it. And that just fascinates me. And they've been some of the people that have encouraged me to start something like this. So let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sexuality. And let's talk about how impactful it is to who we are. But we're also going to talk about the bigger picture too, because how we view anything in life begins with how we view everything in life. So your worldview, your paradigm, your theology, your perspective on philosophy, all of these things actually impact your ability and my ability to interpret what we're feeling and thinking in our own bodies, and how that relates to sexuality. And I'll give you an example. I grew up in a kind of a typical Midwestern military, middle class, Christian, non-denominational, for those of you who know what that means, Protestant family. And I viewed sexual subjects, topics, and principles as very dualistic. So there was a morality associated with it, but that morality was either right or wrong. not only did I have a dualistic perspective, which means there's a two-sided subject, right? It's not a myriad of possibilities, it's just there are two options. So not only did I grow up with that, but I also grew up with a concept of hell or eternal damnation, sin. And when you've got a choice before you of doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing, that's one thing. But when you've got a choice before you of doing right or wrong, and if you do the wrong, you go to hell. That's a very weighty decision. And so what I mean by that is that paradigm that I had of a hell existing and things being right or wrong, that influences how I view everything, including sexuality. So some of the conversations I want to have and be able to kind of create space for, I hate those cliche phrases, but is how our philosophies and our worldviews impact our ability to process sexuality and have the conversations around even gender identity and queer communities and cross-dressing and all of these things that sometimes don't even have to do with sex, and yet we've made it about sex because we link it with sexuality. So with saying that, I'll kind of list off some of the topics that I have in mind for some episodes that I'm excited about sharing. One topic is about the phrase, I got mine. It's a phrase that I really like, and I think it's funny. And I think it has a lot of meaning and implications behind it that would be great to talk about. I want to talk about emotional intimacy. And is that the same as sexual intimacy? I think we all would agree that it's not, or it doesn't have to be. But if we all agree that it's not or doesn't have to be, then why is sexual intimacy so revered? Or why is it considered so important? I don't know if anyone's heard of an emotional affair, but oftentimes we consider a sexual affair to be much worse than an emotional one, and that's interesting to me. How about the fact that I don't like clothing? What is that about? What is clothing? Why? Where did modesty come from? Just as like a little bit of a shock value for you. The note I have around that episode is like, why can't erect body parts be visible? Why can't that just be natural and accepted? Why can't an erect penis just be like, okay, that's what happens to a penis? Or my nipples when they are hard. Why do I have to hide that? Why do I have to have a lined bra? I don't understand. So that's something. Recently I was having a conversation with someone and they said, I don't know if I'm homophobic or if I have any homophobia, but I don't mind gays at all or queer people, but I really don't like their culture. I thought that was interesting. I'm newly to the queer culture, and so I want to dig into a little bit more about that. What is gay culture? What is queer culture? And are there facets of it that are toxic, or are they just different and it's just like liking a culture or not liking a culture? And then also I want to talk about non-monogamy, and I want to talk about sexual identity as far as historically, like where we've come as we've discovered more about women's health. And we've just changed the world with vibrators, we've changed the world with birth control, and it's really created the opportunity for a lot of paradigm shift, and not all of us have taken that opportunity, but it still is there. And I want to talk about responsibility and sexual health and the responsibility that we all have, because I think that responsibility has often, up to this point historically, has been placed on women. So I want to talk about some vasectomies and some situations where things that were considered female problems, health issues, are actually STIs, and they're female and the other partner's sexual health issue, and how can we all take responsibility? So that's some examples. But what I thought I'd start out with today is this idea of spectrum and fluidity, because that's been, for me, probably the crux of me coming to the realization and not realization, the revelation, I guess, of myself and allowing myself to unfold the different layers that exist inside of me and not be afraid of them. And so spectrum for me, I'll just share very briefly, and you'll get to know more of my story as we go, I'm sure. But for me, I've gone from virgin until my wedding night, was abstinent, but I also knew about the technical virgin theory, right, where you do everything but. And I went from abstinence, virgin on my wedding night, to a sexually anorexic marriage, to a divorce, and there's a lot in that, to after my divorce, starting to explore open relationships and giving no judgment to sexual relationships or play. There's a lot in all of that, to experimenting with nudism and polyamory, experimenting with swinger lifestyle, monogamy. I'm engaged currently. And so I just am fascinated by the fact that if that whole journey and kind of like a spectrum exists inside of me, then what exists inside of all the people around me, and do we get to talk about it? So as kind of a starting point, talking about spectrum and fluidity, I found this really interesting. I found the definition, or kind of a definition of spectrum and fluidity. And so what I hadn't considered was this idea, and maybe you all listening have thought of this before, and I'm new to it, but spectrum is this idea, right, that there's no binary option, okay? It's this idea that there's not two fixed points. So instead of black and white, there are not only points in between the two, but there are gradations, nuances, and you can even have multiple possibilities all at once, okay? So let's just blow our Western minds here for a second. Multiple possibilities all at once. And that's what a spectrum is. And obviously we've heard now, it's become more trendy to talk about the spectrums that exist within sexuality and gender identity and that sort of thing. But that's what spectrum means. And then this idea of fluidity is the idea that things are not fixed. So it's the idea that because of personal growth or experience or environment or even mood, things can shift over time. So essentially fluidity and spectrum can exist simultaneously. And, again, we hear about fluidity now. It's very trendy in the arenas of sexuality and gender, right? Even relationships. So for me, I want to establish in this first conversation this idea that I believe sounds a little bit weak. I've observed in my experience, I've seen the existence of spectrum and the existence of fluidity, in my own life. And in order to adhere to this idea that even exists in our reality, to me begs the question of duality. I find it very hard to adhere to this idea. It's more of a Western idea, and we can have a little bit of a discussion on the history of duality and non-duality, but I find it hard to believe that duality exists. Think of it. We talk about yin and yang kind of as a flippant cliche, but truly that was how the Chinese viewed reality, like all of it existing together. Like the light can't exist without the dark, but even in between light and dark, what do you have? You've got everything connected and everything depending on each other. And so it's this idea, for me, it's this idea of that, like everything complements each other, and that any kind of separation that we create, so if we create a separation between sin and purity, that separation is an illusion, because things are not actually opposites. They're actually part of a unified whole. So I want to throw that out there because it's important to have the discussion around non-duality, to be able to speak from a non-hypocritical perspective on the idea of spectrum and fluidity. The idea of spectrum means that multiple things can be possible at once. Well, if that's the case, you can't have opposites. You're going to have, all these beautiful colors of the rainbow occurring at the same time, and they're not even separated from each other. If you look, at a rainbow, it's like constant ombre of this transition between colors. The other example that I like to use for spectrum for myself, the example I use with myself is my children. I have 2 children. I come from a family. I have 2 other siblings, so we were 3. And it's just so fascinating how my children are opposites, but every child that I have would be a quote opposite. Like, it's this endless possibility of, we use the word opposite, but they're not opposites. It's just this endless, this infinite circle, and the points on the circle are infinite. And, pick a combination. So that's kind of the perspective that I have when I come to this idea of sexuality, and that allows, for me, it allows me to have this space. That's why I wanted to have this conversation and have this podcast kind of as our own little room where we get to come have dinner once a week and hang out and talk about these things, because it's such an important topic, and it's also one that has been so impacted by this idea of duality, and I think it's really been harmful. I think it's, I could say harmful, but I do also think that we've all been doing the best we could with what we had at the time, so there's obviously been a historical progression of patriarchy, and also this historical progression of, different races of humans and genders and all of that doing what they needed to do to survive, which created certain patterns in thought and in cultural norms. So I use the word harmful a little tongue-in-cheek because I don't think there was anything that necessarily could have been done differently. I also think that we can continue to progress and continue to learn and continue to change, as we already have quite a bit in the last century. So for me, these conversations are so important. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about the topics that I mentioned, digging in, bringing in some people who have had similar experiences, talking a little bit more about my own experiences. As you heard, if you heard me describe where I've come from, if you want to believe in opposites, I am the opposite of what I was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so there's just so much to dig into and to talk about. And I'm really excited to do that. And I'm really excited to see who comes along in these conversations. But again, my goal is, I can't even express it enough, how there is truly no judgment. I have no need to, and I have no need, and I want to create a space here, create a culture here where there is no need to judge, to make right or to make wrong, because everything is always expanding, everything is always changing and shifting, and we're all learning. And if once you get to know me, you'll realize I am someone who almost never takes offense. You can say whatever you want to say. I have no need for that kind of resistance in my life. And so I want a space where I can be heard, but also hopefully in my sharing, it allows the people listening, you guys listening, to explore some of the things that you want to be heard about. And truly for me, the ability to be heard has to come from a place of full acceptance. And full acceptance is a place where there is no judgment. And so that's my approach, my perspective. And that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about talking about some of these things and getting on my soapbox and then having someone come and tell me why my soapbox is wrong, or getting on my soapbox and it impacting someone in a positive way, or me realizing I don't even have a soapbox. And, this is just a fun conversation. So one of the things I want to close with, or end today with, is a poem. And it's a little bit long, so maybe I'll edit it out, but it truly has been one of my favorite poems in the last few years. And as I said, I experimented a little bit with nudism and what it's like to not have to wear clothing. And anyways, this poem is about clothing. It's from a poetry book called The Prophet, and the poet is Khalil Gibran. A fantastic book and poet, by the way. He's a poet from the turn of the century, and I'm just so enlightened. I love reading his stuff. But here it is. And the weaver said, "Speak to us of clothes." And he answered, "Your clothes conceal much of your beauty, yet they hide not the unbeautiful. And though you seek in garments the freedom of privacy, you may find in them a harness and a chain. Would that you could meet the sun and the wind with more of your skin and less of your raiment. For the breath of life is in the sunlight, and the hand of life is in the wind. Some of you say, it is the north wind who has woven the clothes we wear. And I say, aye, it was the north wind. But shame was his loom, and the softening of the sinews was his thread. And when his work was done, he laughed in the forest. Forget not that modesty is a shield against the eye of the unclean. And when the unclean shall be no more, what were modesty, but a fetter and a fouling of the mind? And forget not that the earth delights to feel your bare feet, and the winds long to play with your hair." And as a reminder, Oscar Wilde once said, and this is how I feel about sexuality and these topics that I've presented and that we get to explore more. He said, "Some things are just too important to take seriously." And that's how I feel about it. I want to have fun. I want to have, like I said, a creative outlet. And I want everyone who is participating or who is interested, if anyone's interested in these topics, that it just feels like a place to relax and to get to know yourself better and to get to know what exists and the possibilities that are out there that maybe don't ever get talked about. So, looking forward to it, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for being here. Tip the lounge or grab your free journal while it lasts at whisperlounge.club.